When Jack first spotted her, he thought she was either drunk or out of her mind. A single figure staggering through the tall grass at dusk, hair tangled, steps uneven. Then he caught the sound. She was laughing. Not the laugh of some carefree young woman, but the cracked laugh of someone who'd already lost everything. A filthy scrap of cloth clung to her shoulders, sliding lower with each shaky step, and she gripped it like it was the last thing she had left of herself. Her skin was bruised, streaked with blood, her face pale as the fading light. The kind of sight that makes a man's blood run cold. Now let me ask you, if you'd seen her there, alone and broken on the prairie, would you have turned away, or would you have walked toward her? Jack Hollis was 51, a man who had buried more years than he had left to live. He'd endured drought, fire, neighbors giving up on the land and drifting away. He thought he'd seen everything this frontier could throw at a man, but nothing in his long, weathered life prepared him for this moment. His horse shifted nervously as he stepped off the trail and walked closer. The nearer he got, the clearer it became. This wasn't some ghost or whiskey dream. This was flesh and blood. A young woman, no older than 24, who looked like she'd crawled straight out of hell. Her bare feet were torn raw, her arms scratched open. But worse than any wound were her eyes. They weren't pleading, not even angry. They were hollow, like her soul had already slipped away. Jack dropped to his knees in the dust just as she stumbled into him. He steadied the cloth at her chest, his rough hands trembling despite themselves. That bitter laugh cracked out of her again, soft and jagged, and then came her voice. Barely a whisper, telling him she was ruined goods, that no kindness could fix that. For the first time in years, Jack Hollis had no words. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. Truth was, she barely did. Just bones, bruises, and the sheer grit that had carried her that last mile. He set her on his horse and led them slowly through the falling light back to the cabin he'd built with his own hands. That little ranch was nothing special. 4 pine walls, a roof that leaked every spring, and a fire steady enough to keep a man alive. Tonight, it would have to keep her alive, too. He laid her down in the spare room. She didn't resist, didn't speak. Just stare at the ceiling as though she wasn't inside her own body anymore. Jack fixed her a plate of beans and bread, set on the table by the bed, and waited. She didn't touch it. He tried again the next morning and the morning after that. Same story. No words, no food, no spark in those empty eyes. Most men would have walked away, maybe even hauled her back to town, claiming she wasn't their problem. But Jack wasn't most men. He did what old ranchers do best. He stayed steady. Every day, he cooked, left fresh water, folded a blanket at the foot of the bed. He even laid one of his old shirts on the chair, worn soft by years of work. Maybe he thought the smell of sweat, smoke, and leather might remind her that not every man in this world meant harm. On the 3rd day, something changed. Jack came in quiet, same as always, and saw her shoulders wrapped in that old shirt. It hung loose on her frame, but she had chosen it. She had chosen not to stay buried in the filthy rag she'd come in with. Her hand trembled as she lifted a piece of bread and chewed slow, as if every bite cost her. When she finally spoke, her voice was no louder than a breath. She told him her name was Anna. Just a name, but to Jack, it was the first crack of light breaking through the dark. And let me ask you this. If a soul that broken found the strength to speak again, wouldn't you stay to see what happens next? For a while, the ranch stayed quiet. Jack stuck to his chores. Anna stayed mostly in the small room, speaking little, eating just enough to stay upright. Life on the edge of the desert doesn't stop for anyone's pain. Horses still needed grain. Fences still broke. Dust still found its way in under every door frame. But something subtle shifted in those days. Jack began to notice she wasn't staring through him anymore. Her eyes followed him when he came in to stoke the fire, when he poured his coffee at dawn, when he chopped wood in the yard. She watched like someone trying to remember what ordinary living looked like she was relearning what a decent man's hands could do. Jack never pressed her with questions. He just kept steady, kept showing up. Sometimes he left a cup of warm milk by her bed. Sometimes he sat on the porch and talked to the evening air about things that didn't matter. How the creek was running low this year, how the neighbor's mule had gone lame, how storms built up over the hills but never seemed to break. He spoke like a man talking to himself, but he knew she was listening. One afternoon, the silence broke in a way Jack didn't expect. He was hauling buckets from the well when he spotted a lone rider moving slow down the trail. The way the man sat his horse told Jack this wasn't a friendly visit. Dust curled behind the hooves as the rider came up to the gate. He glanced over the ranch like it already belonged to him, then spat in the dirt. His coat was too fine for a working man, and his eyes kept darting toward the house. Jack didn't need to be told why he was here. The man swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the ground with a swagger that made Jack's jaw tighten. "Name's Miller," he said flatly. "That girl inside doesn't belong here. She belongs back in Winslow." Jack rested one hand on the rail, the other near the Winchester propped against the wall. He didn't speak. The man smirked, stepped closer. "You hiding her, old man? You think you can keep what isn't yours?" Jack finally answered, voice low and steady. "She belongs to no one." Miller's grin sharpened. "That's not how it works. You've got something men paid for." He took another step, close enough now to smell of sweat and cheap tobacco. That was when Jack moved. In a single motion, the Winchester was in his hands, the lever clicking sharp, the barrel leveled at Miller's chest. The air went still. Even Miller's horse shifted uneasily. That grin on Miller's face faltered. He hadn't expected steel nerves from a man Jack's age. They stared at each other for a long, brittle moment while the wind pushed grit around their boots. Miller finally cursed under his breath, backed away slow, then swung into the saddle. "This ain't finished," he spat, his voice full of hate. And then he turned his horse and rode off, dust boiling up behind him. Jack lowered the rifle, his hands shaking, not from fear but from anger. Anger that some man thought he could just ride up and claim another human being like she was nothing more than property. He knew this wouldn't be the last time someone came looking. Anna had been standing at the window. He saw her pale face through the glass, trembling all over. But there was something new in her eyes, a spark of belief. For the first time since she stumbled out of the grass, she saw someone willing to stand between her and the darkness. And out here on the frontier, every man eventually has to draw a line. Jack had just drawn his. The morning sun rose hard and bright, but Jack could feel trouble before he even saw it. Hooves carried a sound you learn to recognize when you've lived long enough this far out. Too many riders coming too fast, not neighbors dropping by. Two horses appeared first, riders with their hands hanging low near their holsters. Behind them came a third man, heavy in the saddle, broad-shouldered, riding like he owned every mile of dirt he crossed. Jack knew him the second he saw his face. Years ago, they had ridden the same cattle drives, slept under the same stars, shared hard bread and cold coffee by the fire. But time cuts men into different shapes. "Calder," Jack muttered under his breath. The man hadn't changed much, still wore the kind of smile that didn't touch his eyes. The three horses pulled up at the gate. Calder looked around the ranch like he was taking inventory, then gave a short laugh. "Still scratching out a living here, I see. But you've got something that doesn't belong to you." His voice was as dry as the dirt under their boots. "You know the girl I came for." Jack stood on the porch, rifle across his hands, but not yet aimed. "She's not yours," he said evenly. Calder shook his head with mock pity. "That's where you're wrong. She belongs to the house she ran from. Men pay good money for her. Men don't like being cheated." His riders spread out a little, cutting off the yard like wolves. "You think you can hide her here like a stray dog?" Jack's voice stayed calm. "She stays." Calder's grin thinned to a hard line. "Then you pay. Nothing comes free, old friend. You want to keep her? Hand me that piece of creek land. Water's worth more than any woman, and you know it." For a long moment Jack said nothing. That land was his blood and years, the one patch of ground that had never failed him. He would sooner burn the cabin to the ground than give it up. His grip tightened on the rifle. If a fight started, he knew it would end in blood. Then he felt it, a light touch on his arm. Anna had stepped onto the porch behind him. Her voice, soft but sharp with fear, cut through everything. "If they take me back, they'll kill me." Jack turned, meeting her eyes. Wide, not with tears, but with raw terror. It was the first time she'd asked him for anything. Not food, not comfort, just life itself. Something inside Jack cracked. Land was everything to a man like him. But what was a stretch of earth compared to a soul begging not to be thrown back into the fire? His jaw clenched hard. Slowly, painfully, he lowered the rifle and met Calder's gaze. "You take the creek, Land," Jack said, voice gravel low. "But she stays." Calder studied him for a long beat, then barked a laugh. Always the fool with the soft heart. He spat in the dirt, jerked the reins, and with a quick signal, his riders wheeled their horses around. The three of them rode off into the morning sun, dust boiling in their wake. The ranch felt smaller after they left. Quieter, emptier. Jack stood on the porch, rifle still in hand, while Anna leaned against the post, shaking, not from fear now, but from relief so strong it nearly knocked her down. Jack didn't say a word. He knew exactly what he had given up, and he knew exactly what he had saved. The days after Calder rode away carried a strange weight. The land by the creek was gone, signed over without a fight. Jack could still see every inch of it in his mind. The bend where the cottonwoods grew thick, the bank where deer came to drink at dusk. Giving it up felt like carving out a piece of himself and handing it to a man who didn't deserve it. But there was something else in the air, too. In the early mornings, when the first light rolled over the hills and the smell of coffee drifted through the cabin, Jack felt a quiet he hadn't known in years. Not the empty kind, not the loneliness that clings to an old man's shoulders, but something softer. He'd saved her. That mattered more than land, more than pride, more than the slow ache in his chest when he thought about that creek. Anna began moving around the ranch in small ways. At first, it was just folding her blanket without being asked or sweeping a corner of the porch while Jack pretended not to notice. She fed the chickens one morning, holding out grain with trembling hands. And when the old mule in the corral refused to budge for Jack later that week, Anna laughed. It was only a quiet laugh, more breath than sound, but it wasn't bitter anymore. It sounded alive. Jack didn't ask about her past. He didn't need to. A man can see when someone's been broken and doesn't need reminding. He just worked alongside her, fixing the gate, hauling water, chopping wood. He spoke little, but his silences weren't cold. Sometimes they shared bread by the fire, sitting so close they could hear the crackle of the logs louder than their own breathing. Sometimes they sat on the porch as the Arizona sky burned red, saying nothing at all. But Jack watched her closely. He saw how she flinched when a shadow crossed the window, how her hand shook whenever a rider passed on the distant trail. He wanted to promise her she was safe now. He wanted to swear no one would touch her again. But a man who's lived long enough knows better than to make promises he can't keep. One evening, as the light bled out of the sky, Jack found her standing by the corral fence, staring at the horizon. "You're thinking too hard," he said softly. Anna didn't look at him. Men like him don't stop. Jack rested his arms on the top rail. Men like him can be stopped. They just don't expect anyone to stand up to them. She turned, her face pale in the fading light. "You gave him your land. For me. You didn't even know me." Jack met her eyes, calm but steady. "I know enough. You're worth more than dirt." For a long time, she didn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Nobody's ever said that to me before." Jack swallowed hard. He wasn't a man used to soft words, not even to himself. "Then maybe you've been around the wrong people." They stood there a while longer in the deepening dusk, two broken lives leaning on the same fence post. Anna looked away first, brushing her hair back from her face. "I don't know how to thank you." Jack shook his head. "Don't. Just stay alive. That's thanks enough." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dry sage and far-off rain. Jack felt a familiar unease settle in his bones. Calder wasn't the kind of man to ride away empty-handed and let it lie. The creek land was a prize, sure, but men like him didn't trade power for peace. Jack figured there'd be more riders before long, maybe a knock at the door in the dead of night, maybe worse. Still, when he looked at Anna sitting by the fire later that evening, shoulders curled forward, face softened by the glow, he felt something he hadn't in years. Not hope exactly, something steadier, a reason to get up every morning. And if you've ever known the taste of real loneliness, you'd understand what it means when another soul gives you that reason, without even trying. The nights were calm for a while. Jack slept light, like always, waking at every creak of the cabin walls. Anna began to look less hollow. Her cheeks filled out a little. She started helping with the small things around the place, washing dishes, gathering eggs, brushing down the old horse, even though it made her nervous. Jack kept his distance in words, but not in heart. He never asked about Winslow, never asked what she'd run from or what those men had done. Some things you don't need spelled out to understand. Every bruise already told the story. But quiet never lasts long in country like this. Jack knew at the moment he heard hoofbeats again one morning, long before the riders came into view. They didn't come slow this time. Dust rolled high behind 3 horses, all moving hard. Jack stepped onto the porch, Winchester in hand, heart steady. Calder was back, but now there were 5 men behind him, not 2. All carried themselves like they had work to do, ugly work. Anna stood inside the doorway, frozen. Calder pulled up and tipped his hat, that same fake grin on his face. "Jack, you always were a stubborn fool. I thought we had a deal." Jack didn't move. "You got the creek land. You're not getting her." Calder's grin vanished. "You don't get it, do you? She's property. Men paid. I can't just let her go, or they'll think I'm weak." His hand rested near his gun. "Step aside. Last chance." Jack's voice stayed low but hard. "No." The men spread out in a half circle. The air went sharp and still. Even the wind stopped moving. For a long moment, no one spoke. Anna's breath hitched in the doorway. Then Calder chuckled coldly. "You're ready to die for her? Old man, you're outnumbered." Jack's finger rested on the trigger. "Maybe, but I'll take the first 2 with me. You know I will." The words hung heavy. Calder's men shifted in their saddles. Nobody wanted to be the first to fall. Calder spat in the dust, eyes narrowed. "This isn't over." He pulled on the reins, turning his horse. "Next time I won't talk first." The riders wheeled and galloped off, leaving the yard choked with dust. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves faded over the hills. His hands shook again, not from fear, but from fury so deep it made his chest hurt. Anna stepped onto the porch, pale as the moon. "They'll come back," she whispered. Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, they will." For a long time they just stood there, not speaking. The smell of gun oil clung to the air. Finally, Jack said, "You should think about leaving. Maybe ride east, find a town where they don't know your name." Anna shook her head, tears shining in her eyes. "If I run, they'll find me. If I stay, at least I know you'll fight for me." Jack looked at her then, really looked at her. She wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking for something far harder, for someone to keep standing between her and the dark, even when it hurt. And Jack Hollis wasn't the kind of man to walk away from that. The days after that standoff felt tense, like the whole ranch was holding its breath. Jack went about his chores as usual, but every creak of the windmill and every shadow on the ridge made him glance up. Anna felt it too. She tried to act calm, sweeping the porch, mending an old shirt of his, but her hands shook with every knock of a loose shutter. Jack fixed the fence, oiled his rifle, checked the saddles twice over. He didn't say it out loud, but Anna knew he was getting ready for something. Calder wouldn't forget. Men like him never did. One evening, while the sun was sliding low, Anna sat by the fire, sewing with her head bent down. Jack watched her for a long moment. She wasn't the same hollow girl he'd found in the tall grass. There was color in her cheeks now, but there was also a weight she carried, the kind that didn't fade with food and rest. "You ever think about what comes next?" Jack asked quietly. Anna didn't look up. "Every night." And she set the needle down, her voice soft. "I don't see much. Just trying to stay alive one more day." Jack nodded. He understood that way of thinking. He'd lived it himself during the hardest years when the rain didn't come, when friends packed up and vanished, when graves got dug faster than wells. That night, he didn't sleep much. He sat on the porch with the rifle across his knees, listening to the coyotes cry in the distance. The stars looked sharp enough to cut a man's hands if he reached for them. The next morning, Anna surprised him. She was already outside, hauling water from the well. "Thought I'd beat you to it," she said, forcing a smile. Jack raised an eyebrow. "That bucket's half your weight." Maybe I need the practice, she said, setting it down hard. If they come, I don't want to just hide. I'm tired of hiding. Jack studied her a moment, then shook his head. Bravery's good, but staying alive's better. Let me handle Calder. She looked him in the eye. You can't do it alone. Something in her voice struck him deep. It wasn't fear. It was resolve. Jack didn't argue again. Later that afternoon, they sat on the porch sharing coffee in tin mugs. Anna stared at the horizon. Why'd you really give up that creek land? She asked suddenly. Jack shrugged, eyes on the ground. Because you asked me to live. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Anna whispered, No one's ever chosen me over something that mattered. Jack finally looked at her, his voice rough. Then they didn't know what mattered. Before he could say more, the sound of distant hoofbeats rolled over the hills. Not fast, not charging, steady, like men taking their time. Jack stood, rifle already in his hands. Anna's face went pale, but she didn't run. She stepped closer to him instead. Jack glanced at her. Inside. Lock the door. I'm not hiding this time, she said firmly. Jack wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. 3 riders appeared on the ridge, silhouettes dark against the dying sun. The lead man wasn't Calder. Someone younger, lean, wearing a black hat pulled low. But Jack didn't need to ask who sent him. The riders came slow down the trail, eyes cold, hands near their guns. Jack's heart stayed steady. This was coming sooner than he thought. The 3 riders stopped at the gate, dust hanging around them like smoke. The one in the black hat didn't speak right away. He just sat his horse easy, like a man who didn't need to rush because he believed time was already on his side. His face was young but hard, his eyes too cold for his age. You Hollis? He finally asked. Jack stood on the porch, rifle low but ready. That's right. The man nodded toward the house. Girl's inside. She's not yours to take, Jack said. His voice was calm, but Anna, standing just behind him, could hear the edge under it. The young man smirked. Everything's got a price. You paid once with land. Now Calder says you pay again. This time with your pride. Jack didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that some words only make trouble louder. The rider swung down, boots hitting the ground, and walked up slow. His men stayed on horseback, watching like hawks. Anna's breath caught. Jack could feel her fear without turning around, but he also felt her staying put, refusing to back away. Calder says she comes back to Winslow, the man said flatly. Says she's run enough. Jack's voice was rough now. She's not going anywhere. The man's grin faded. You willing to die for her? Jack lifted the rifle just enough to make his meaning clear. I'm willing to make sure you don't get her. For a moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then Anna stepped forward onto the porch, past Jack's shoulder. Her voice shook, but she forced it steady. I'm not going back, she said, staring straight at the man. Not alive. The rider looked her over like she was a mule he'd been sent to collect. You talk big for someone who don't have a gun. Anna didn't flinch. I don't need one. He's got enough for both of us. Jack felt something deep in his chest at those words. Not pride exactly, but something close. For the first time since he'd found her stumbling in the grass, she wasn't just surviving. She was standing up. The young man's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, and Jack raised a rifle fully now, finger easy on the trigger. Take one more step, Jack said, his voice low as gravel, and your friends will have to ride home without you. The 2 men on horseback tensed. One hand twitched near a revolver, but the rider in the black hat hesitated. He wasn't ready to test an old rancher who'd spent his whole life with a rifle in hand. Finally, he spat in the dirt. Calder won't like this. He backed up slow, swung into the saddle, and jerked his chin at his men. We're done here for now. They turned and rode off, dust trailing behind them like a warning. Jack didn't lower the rifle until they vanished over the ridge. Inside, Anna sank into a chair, hands shaking hard now that it was over. Jack poured her water, set it in front of her without a word. She drank with trembling fingers. Why won't they stop? She whispered. Because men like Calder can't stand losing, Jack said quietly. Doesn't matter what it costs him. He'll keep coming. Anna looked at him then, her eyes wide but clear. You should let me go. If I leave, maybe they'll stop bothering you. Jack shook his head, slow and firm. Not happening. You're not running alone. Not while I'm still breathing. Anna pressed her lips together, and for the first time, tears rolled down her face, not from fear, but from something harder to bear. No one had ever stood for her like this before. Jack looked away, pretending to busy himself with the coffee pot. But the truth burned in his chest. He wasn't just fighting Calder to keep her safe anymore. He was fighting because she'd made him feel alive again, in a way he hadn't felt in years. And out here on the edge of nowhere, a reason to keep going is rarer than gold. Calder didn't wait long. 2 mornings later, Jack woke to the sound of hooves pounding hard and fast. Not 3 this time, 6. Men spread wide as they rode in, rifles glinting in the dawn light. Jack stepped onto the porch, Winchester ready, heart steady. Calder dismounted first, his smile gone now, his face like carved stone. "I gave you a chance, Hollis. You should have taken it." Jack said nothing. Anna stood just inside the doorway, pale but unshaken. She hadn't run. Not this time. "You think you're a hero?" Calder barked. "You think you can stand against me, against all of us?" Jack raised the rifle to his shoulder. "I don't think it. I know it. Because right is still right, even if a man stand alone." The yard went dead silent. Calder's men glanced at each other, unsure. They'd come for an easy victory, not a man willing to fight to the last breath. Calder took a step forward, rage flashing in his eyes. "Move aside, old man, or I'll put you in the ground." Jack's voice didn't waver. "Then start digging. But you're not laying a hand on her." Something cracked in that moment. Not in Jack, but in Calder. Bullies are brave until they meet someone who doesn't blink. He snarled, but he didn't give the order to fire. His men weren't eager to die over a girl they didn't even know. One by one, their eyes dropped. Calder cursed under his breath, fury twisting his face, but he knew he'd lost. "This isn't over," he spat. He swung into his saddle, and with a hard jerk of his reins, the riders turned and galloped off, dust boiling behind them. Jack stood there, rifle still aimed, until the sound of hooves disappeared. Only then did his shoulders sag, the weight of it all finally pressing down. Anna stepped out onto the porch, her hands trembling, but her eyes bright. "They're gone," she whispered. "For now," Jack said. His voice was tired but steady. Anna reached for his arm. "You didn't have to do this for me." Jack looked at her long and hard. "Yes, I did." She swallowed. "You gave up your land. You risked your life." "Why?" Jack took off his hat, rubbed the sweat from his brow. "Because a person's worth isn't measured in acres or dollars. It's measured in what you're willing to give to do right by them. You're not property. You're not a burden. You're a soul. And if a man forgets that, he loses himself, no matter how much land he owns." For a long moment, Anna didn't speak. Then tears filled her eyes, but this time they were soft, not bitter. "No one's ever fought for me before." Jack gave a faint smile. "Then maybe it's about time someone did." In the days that followed, the ranch felt different. The land by the creek was gone, but the air around the cabin felt lighter. Anna moved through her chores with a quiet strength. Jack worked beside her, his steps slower now, but steadier. In the evenings, they shared bread on the porch and watched the sun bleed red across the hills. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't need to. The fear didn't vanish overnight. Calder might come back someday. But something had changed forever. Anna no longer carried herself like a shadow. She stood taller, spoke louder. And Jack Hollis, a man who thought he'd seen everything the West could throw at him, had found something he didn't expect: peace. And here's the truth of it. Out here, a man's soul is tested not by what he can take, but by what he's willing to give up. Jack gave away a piece of land, his pride, his comfort, to save a broken soul who still had a life worth living. Sometimes the hardest choice a man can make is also the one that keeps his heart whole. So ask yourself, if it came down to protecting another person or holding on to what's yours, which would you choose? Because in the end, it's not the acres you own or the money in your pocket that defines you. It's the line you're willing to draw, and whether you've got the courage to stand on it.